Hello guys, it's me Simo Urahara, and in this video we'll talk about the weak points of 20 Bankai in Bleach. There are dozens of videos about the strongest Bankai as well as the weakest, and I have done some of them like this one. However, when I was reviewing the battle of Hisagi and Hikone in the novel, it caught my attention Hikone's words when he was surprised by how Hisagi's Bankai seemed to him to have no weak points, and this is something, as Hikone described, it's impossible because the Bankai or every Zanpakuto must have a weak point, and this is where he started to show us the weakness of some Zanpakutos. And by the way, this is a good chance to respond to some people about why I make a lot of videos about the novels. The answer is clear and simple. There is no anime right now or even new chapters from Kubo. That's why it's a good chance to focus on the events of the novel, because there are many things that can be talked about, and there are things that I didn't talk about, such as the entire fight between Hikone and Hisagi, or retailing events in detail, such as Aizen's past with Tosen. And also we can talk about what have been said in the anime and the manga and link it to some of the events in the novel. So back to the list of this video, and as a big PS, this list is not about the strongest Bankai, but rather, as I said, about the Bankai that have weak points, or let's say obstacles that make releasing them difficult. So that we will start from the Bankai that have the list of those obstacles or weak points to the Bankai that have a lot of them. That's why I have made 5 factors to be on for this list. First of all, does the Bankai have a weakness? Second, does the Bankai cause a personal damage to its owner? And third, does the Bankai cause a damage to its surroundings? And 4, how much time it takes the Bankai to be released again? And 5, the effectiveness. And this 5th factor is the major factor that determines for me in which rank I put this Bankai. So let's go guys. But before that guys, don't forget to put some of your reactions in this video, either by clicking like or leaving a comment to discuss the topic of this video. And if you have a stronger reaction, you can become a member in my channel or through Patreon. And this is a good chance to thank again all the members of my supporting squad, either in YouTube or Patreon. Thank you guys so much. The beginning will be with the Bankai of Ichibe Shirafudi. So this Bankai has almost no weak points. The Bankai doesn't pose any physical harm to Ichibe. Secondly, it doesn't have any external harm to its surroundings, because Ichibe is the one who determines the target to which he will put the new name on. And here lies the effectiveness of the Bankai. Hadn't been for the presence of the Almighty, Yamamoto would have been just a powerless black ant. In addition, Ichibe had previously activated the Bankai on the holo that broke into the Soul Society a long time ago, and gave it the name Ikomokodomoi. However, there are 2 points that we can talk about. Ichibe's Bankai, and unlike the most of the Bankais, cannot be released directly. For example, a Shinigami is able to release the Bankai without the need of Shikai, like the case of Onohana, Urahara, Kensei, etc. But for Ichibe, he needs the ink of the Shikai in order to give the new name. Another thing is to talk about the effectiveness of Ichimonji when the king's parts are inside the target of Shirafudi, because some believe that what Ikomokodomoi did when he absorbed some of the parts of Ryo that were present in Hikone helped Ikomokodomoi to get rid of the ability of the Bankai. And so based on that, some said that the Bankai is weak against Ryo's power, but I don't think so, because I think at the beginning of the novel we saw that Ichibe said the remaining power of Yamamoto under the name of Ryo. And as you know, the remains of Yamamoto contained the remains of Ryo and Mimihagi. And we move on to Gin's Bankai. Gin's Bankai is also like Ichibe's Bankai in many ways. It doesn't have a major weaknesses. It doesn't harm its owner. Gin can release the Bankai ability directly from his sword without suffering any damage. In addition, his attack is directed and specific towards a specific point inside the enemy's body. And more than that, the effectiveness of the Bankai is very high. The poison destroyed the body cells as it did with Aizen Sosuke. It remains only one point that we can say about this Bankai, and actually I wouldn't have thought about it if Kubo didn't mention it in his last answer in Club Outside. So according to Kubo, when Gin releases the Bankai needs some time to secrete the poison again. For example, if Gin releases the Bankai and missed the target, then he will need some time to resecrete the poison. And we move to Byakuya's Bankai. Kuchiki Byakuya has a good control over his Bankai, such that he can direct the petals of the Bankai towards any place he wants. Its effectiveness is very high because the petals are very sharp and in many numbers, and we have witnessed this in all of Byakuya's battles, whether against Zomari or Tsukushima. And speaking of Tsukushima, this leads me to talk about the only weak point that Senbon Zakar has. Unlike many Bankai that didn't develop a mechanism to protect their owners without affecting their effectiveness, Byakuya's Zanpakuto provided him with a safety zone that protected him from the ability of his Zanpakuto, whether in the Shikai or Bankai, because if the petals somehow touch Byakuya, he will also suffer a damage. So if anyone enters Byakuya's safety zone, then it will put Byakuya in a trouble because then he will not be protected from his power. However, the existence of the safety zone itself and how the Bankai works makes this possibility very small. And so as I said, there are some Bankai, although they have some damage, they are very effective on the field. And among them, Ichigo's Bankai. It is true that Ichigo throughout the events of the story was suffering a lot with his Bankai, regardless of the fact that he was fighting with what is called a fake Bankai. He was merely struggling to control his Shinigami powers mixed with the Holo, especially in keeping the mask, or when his powers became uncontrollable, but at the same time the effectiveness of the Bankai was clear with every opponent he faced, and almost all the obstacles that Ichigo had were removed. And all that remained was that Ichigo, at the end of the battle with Urahara, hadn't yet reached the full competence in controlling his combined powers. But as it was said in the novel, the negative point in Zangetsu is that he consumes a lot of Ryatsu. And here we are with one of the strongest Bankai in the story, Zankai no Tachi. We all know that Yamamoto's Bankai is one of the few Bankais that has strong defensive and offensive capabilities, so it is difficult for anyone to come close to the old man while he is in the Bankai stage. Therefore, I believe that the one who can defeat Yamamoto's Bankai while he is in the Bankai stage is the power of the Bankai itself. The Bankai's weak point is its great destructive power, because Yamamoto releasing the Bankai for a long period of time may destroy the Soul Society, and not only that, but even Yamamoto will be destroyed along with it. However, the effectiveness of the Bankai remains very high, because Yamamoto can avoid all that damage if he defeats the opponent very quickly. Moreover, he is able to relaunch the Bankai despite using it in a short time. And we move on to Zaraki's Bankai. Although this Bankai puts Zaraki in an unconscious state, and also if Yachiyo increases the power of the Bankai, Zaraki's body will suffer great damage. But in the end, these obstacles are not permanent effects of the Bankai and can be overcome, and the effectiveness of the Bankai remains very strong, especially in giving Zaraki speed and catching power, and this greatly helps him in finishing the opponents very quickly. And so we have here the Bankai of the 8th Kenpachi, one of the strongest Bankai in the story, both in terms of ability and effectiveness. His ability to integrate with his surroundings and control them over a wide range makes him capable of avoiding attacks as well as attacking unexpected and multiple locations at the same time. But on the other hand, this ability is not for free. The fact that Asashiro Soya kept his Bankai activated for a long time since he was young made him not train in order to gain physical strength. Thus, without Bankai, the body of Asashiro Soya would become exposed to great damage for the smallest attacks. In addition, the 8th Kenpachi is vulnerable to being harmed if someone uses any weapon that absorbs Ryatsu or Reishi, since the 8th Kenpachi's Bankai basically fuses with Reishi, and therefore the Bankai of the 8th Kenpachi has a problem with any ability that can absorb the Reishi, plus the fact that his body is weak because he has been activating the Bankai for a long time. In addition to that, he also needs times if he wants to reactivate the Bankai in a large area after he removes the Bankai, but the effectiveness of the Bankai remains very strong. And here we are with one of the distinctive Bankai, Rose's Bankai. This Bankai has an amazing ability and also doesn't cause any damage to Rose or his surroundings, only the opponents. The music that the Bankai releases and the dances of those monsters that surrounds the victim make him exposed to multiple effects such as water or fire attacks, and its effect is real. Except that the Bankai's weak point is Rose's mouth. Yes, because in his battle Rose was the one who revealed the weakness of his Bankai. to masculine. So the effects of the Bankai remains active as long as the person listens to these tones. That's why masculine, when he destroyed his eardrums, the effects of the Bankai disappeared. And we move on to the Bankai of Tosen. Tosen's Bankai has one of the abilities that amazes me. As we know, the Bankai deactivates all the senses of the opponent, except the sense of touch. In addition, Tosen is not exposed to any damage from his Bankai. Therefore, the Bankai's only flaw is found in one of the aspects of the Bankai's ability, which is the sense of touch. This is the sense that the Bankai doesn't affect, and as we saw with Zaraki, as soon as he touched the handle of Tosen's Zanpakuto and managed to cause Tosen a severe wounds, the Bankai ability has been removed. And we move on to Urahara's Bankai. As we know, the main ability of Urahara's Bankai is to restructure everything the Bankai touches. However, the Bankai's weak point is in its limited range. If the opponent exceeds the specified area, the Bankai's ability will be disabled. Other than that, the Bankai doesn't have a negative effect on Kisuke. On the opposite, the Bankai enables him to treat serious injuries, such as the eye injury he suffered. And we come to Mayuri's Bankai. Frankly, it can be said that Mayuri's Bankai doesn't have many weak points because its owner is Mayuri, who is responsible for modifying it a lot of times and keep improving it with more new abilities, so much so that Mayuri changed the Bankai's main ability significantly. For example, if we look at the ability of the actual Bankai, it's poison. Unlike Urahara Kisuke, they both share that their Bankai are manifested in the form of a being, and the range of their ability is limited. In the case of Mayuri, the Bankai's poison is released at a range of 182 meters. However, it's believed that the Bankai's ability could be negated with Ryatsu. If we rely on episode 245, when Mayuri Zanpakuto released the Bankai and attacked Ichigo and Renji in Rukia, as well as the rest of the deputies, they were all affected by poison, except Zaraki. And Kyoraku explained this matter, and as you can see, he said that Zaraki's Ryatsu nullified the Bankai's ability. However, as I said, we can't rely on this information since it was mentioned in a filler episode. However, the weak point that I see in this Bankai is its large size. Its size is very big and therefore it can be attacked from afar without the need to approach Mayuri or the Bankai. Perhaps the most prominent example is what Yuri did. Of course, Mayuri modified his Bankai and made it based on other abilities. But as I said, the large size of the Bankai remains a weakness in my opinion. And we move to Soifon's Bankai. It's one of the few Bankais that has a different ability than the Shikai, which is against Soifon's style. The heavy weight of the Bankai in its working mechanism prevent the Bankai from moving freely, which makes it an easy target for the enemy if he attacks from afar. In addition, she has a type of Bankai that requires a certain amount of time to release it again. It is true that she trained to improve the time difference between each release of the Bankai, but these are all factors that make Soifon's Bankai a Bankai that doesn't serve Soifon's actual capabilities. And we move to Sergeant Komamura's Bankai. Sergeant Komamura's Bankai is one of the big Bankais. However, I don't see the Bankai's huge size is the real weak point, but rather something else, which, strangely enough, is also considered a strong point. And I'm talking here about the unique relationship that exists between Komamura and his Bankai. Since any damage to the Bankai also reflects on Komamura, this makes the opponent able to get rid of the Bankai only by attacking Komamura himself and thus eliminating him with his Bankai, or vice versa. While the only major advantage of the Bankai is that if it is broken, it returns to how it was before. And we have also Isshin's Bankai. It is true that this Bankai has not yet appeared in the story, but we have some information about it, which is that Isshin cannot release the Bankai if he is severely injured, because the Bankai puts a great pressure on Isshin's body, and thus releasing the Bankai while he has a serious injury, it could put his life in danger. And we have Rukia's Bankai. Is one of the most dangerous Bankai for its owner, as we know that the ability of Rukia's Bankai or Rukia real Zanpakuto is to lower her body temperature, and this manipulation of temperature has risks even in the Shikai, let alone the Bankai. Her entire body becomes covered in ice, and any simple mistake could cost her body. As for Ikako's Bankai, frankly has one of the biggest weaknesses, if not the biggest, especially when we know that the possibility of repairing the Bankai if it is broken is almost impossible process. Although the Bankai gives Ikako great destructive power, the Bankai's blade is fragile, and this is what we have seen the Bankai had broken in his battle in the Arankara arc. And here we are come to the 4 Bankai that I see the most complex in terms of weaknesses, or let's say the obstacles they have, whether to their owner or those around them. And the beginning will be with Kyoraku's Bankai. This Bankai was the first Bankai to be described by Okitake that this is a Bankai that shouldn't be released in public. For example, we know that Urahara Kisuke has a Bankai that he couldn't train others with, as he told Shadow, while Okitake told Kyoraku not to release the Bankai because if he did so, everyone within the range of the Bankai's ability would be subject to the influence of its abilities. And this is what is dangerous about this category of the Bankai. It has a wide range and also it doesn't differentiate between the enemy and the friend. And the problem with Kyoraku's Bankai is that some of its chapters cause damage even to Kyoraku. In the first chapter, he shares wounds with the opponent. Yes, it is true that Kyoraku may benefit if he has many wounds and the opponent has few. But in the third chapter, Kyoraku and the opponent sink to the bottom of the ocean until the Ryatsu are exhausted. And therefore, when Kyoraku finishes releasing his Bankai, he will have exhausted a large amount of Ryatsu. And as Kyoraku described his Bankai, he cannot release it consecutively. Although Hisaki's Bankai is not large in range and does not pose a threat to the environment in which it is located, it can be said that this is the Bankai that harms its owner the most, to the point that we can call it a suicide Bankai, because it collects Hisaki's Ryatsu in his opponent in a big orb, and whoever attacks the other, the Ryatsu of both of them will decrease according to the amount of attack, meaning that Hisaki is also affected. And if the matter remains like this, if they continue fighting, they will reach a point where the orb's Ryatsu ends and then both of them they will die. And for this reason, this Bankai needs a third party outside the Bankai to finish Hisaki's opponent when the Ryatsu of both of them is about to expire. And here is the problem. What if Hisaki was in a situation where there was no one by his side and he was forced to release the Bankai? Then we have the 7th Kenpachi, the Bankai of the 7th Kenpachi, one of the most difficult Bankai to launch in the story. It's like Kyoraku's Bankai, covers a large area and also doesn't differentiate between the friends and the enemy. Everyone falls into the jaw of this Bankai. However, unlike Kyoraku's Bankai, it has no abilities. It's just a jaw that emerges from the ground and devours everything. Also, it can only be released after each 6 months. Therefore, the Bankai cannot be released in a mixed place, and even if there is a place where there is no allies, he will release it one time and wait another 6 months to release it again. And we come to the first place on this list, Hirako's Bankai. This Bankai frankly has a lot of negative things. Firstly, it's like the 7th Kenpachi's Bankai or Kyoraku's Bankai. It has a wide range ability, and its ability turns the concept of the enemy and ally and makes everyone exposed to this ability, and therefore if Hirako's ally were affected by this ability, they will kill each other. In addition, and this is a big problem, Hirako cannot release the Bankai in front of one person, and that means, for example, the 7th Kenpachi in the end can release the Bankai against one person, even if the Bankai's effect is widespread. But for Hirako, it's not possible. There must be several people. What's more, the effectiveness of this Bankai is very weak. It is a Bankai for the foot soldiers, and this is exactly how it is described in the novel, and this is what we have seen in the anime. Hirako released the Bankai in front of soldiers. So guys, that's my list for 20 Bankai, from the Bankai that have a few weak points to the ones that have a lot of them. In the end, everyone can make his own list. These are the criteria that I have chosen to make this list. As I said, the effectiveness factor was the one that made me mix some Bankai in a good ranks. Because some Bankai, though they have some bad weak points, like the harms that can cause to their owners, like Zaraki or Ichigo, or their surroundings like Yamamoto, but they still can use their Bankai to cause a great damage to the enemy. But some Bankai are useless, frankly, like Hirako's Bankai. Many conditions but low effectiveness. And I didn't include some Bankai like Renji's Bankai or Unohana's Bankai or Toshiro's Bankai, just because I have chosen 20 Bankai, so I couldn't include all of them. And actually, I wanted to include Shinjimaru's Bankai in a list of the strongest Bankai that I may make in the future. But I told myself I have to wait to see the full picture of this Bankai. Shinjimaru's battle didn't finish yet, so we need to wait a little bit to see the full picture and then I can give my final judge. So guys, what about you? Tell me your opinions in the comments and see you guys in my next video.